Hi, folks. We're going to continue on here exploring the intricacies in the development of labeling theory. When we finished last, we were talking about mental illness, and we're going to continue with that for a little bit more. One of the important theorists in using labeling theory in addressing mental illness is Rosen. And Rosen studied labeling and mental illness in 1973. Many of you are too young to remember the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but that particular film starred Jack Nicholson, won the Academy Award, looked at what was going on in mental institutions in the United States in the 1970s. And kind of shed light on some things that were happening. In Rosen's study, he recruited 8 pseudo-patients that were to simulate psychosis. And essentially, they were admitted to 12 different mental hospitals throughout the U.S. And once they were hospitalized, they stopped showing the symptoms of the mental illness that they came in with. And once they stopped simulating the deviant behaviors and began acting normal, what they realized is that it became very difficult proving themselves to be sane. And part of the reason is that once they were labeled mentally ill by the staff and by the doctors, then that was the label that stuck. Ultimately, these patients were issued over 2,000 pills and were hospitalized an average of 19 days. Labeling theory has also been used in understanding delinquency. Labeling theory was used to create or change policies that impacted the lives of young offenders. Over time, the theory gave light to the negative impact of being labeled and threatened as criminals on youth. Essentially, what they were finding is that when you labeled someone deviant and society learned of that label, the construction of the label within the person's mind started to convince themselves that they were deviant, and then society started to play along as well. They accepted the label and started treating the individual as deviant, and then over time we find them engaging in secondary deviance, which is more problematic. Chambliss studied this issue looking at the Roughnecks versus the Saints. The study showed the impact of labels and how difficult it can be for those with less power to resist them. The seriousness of crimes and consequentiality were really divvied out to certain groups in different ways. The Saints, who were generally children of wealthier people, were given the benefit of the doubt, and the Roughnecks, which were generally less powerful individuals, kids coming from less powerful families. When they did similar acts of deviance, they were held accountable for that in a different way, and that ended up making them more likely to engage in secondary deviance down the road. So the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be constructed as deviant. We also know that incarcerated youths and the idea of perceived negative labels goes together. Negative labels imposed by teachers, parents, and peers related to increased involvement in self-reported delinquencies. So if your close social network is defining you as deviant, you're more likely to engage in deviant behaviors. This supports labeling theory and the idea of secondary deviance, which we talked about before, where informal labeling by teachers, peers, and parents turn out to be more important than formal processing through the system itself. Some other considerations of labeling and delinquency, sanctioning and official labels of delinquency. When we think about this particular category, we have to remember that context matters. Hirschfield in 2008 took a macro level context of severely disadvantaged neighborhoods being and found out that being arrested ultimately carries little stigma within the community itself, but those same individuals were more concerned with informal labels by family and friends. So if you're an inner city ghetto kid and you get arrested, that's really not seen as that much of a deviant behavior. But if you're an inner city ghetto kid and your mother starts to see you as a thug, that's a whole different story. And it's going to hold more weight than being scooped up by the criminal justice system. John Braithwaite's study on crime, shame, and reintegration is another important contemporary study of the use of labeling. Braithwaite found lower crime rates tended to exist in communities that were illustrating the shame of the crime. And depending on what type of shame you're bringing, whether it's reintegrative or stigmatizing shame, is extremely important. So if you're engaging in reintegrative shaming, something like drug court, for example, where the individual is ultimately viewed as a good person who has done a bad deed. And as long as they come in front of the court, admit that they did a bad deed, and then go through the process that the court deems appropriate to addressing this bad deed, then they can be essentially have their sins washed away, if you will, and reintegrate back into society without the impacts of a negative stigma. Stigmatization, on the other hand, labels the offender as a bad person and essentially doesn't forgive them for their bad acts. This in turn shows us that labeling makes things worse when we are stigmatizing, and of course there are big policy implications in reference to this, and labeling reintegrative labeling could actually reduce crime, whereas stigmatizing labeling can increase crime. Ras Matsuda in 1992 continued some studies, some contemporary studies using labeling theory, where Matsuda was talking about reflective appraisals, parental labeling, and delinquency. According to Matsuda, labeling and the reflected appraisals of others can create a delinquent self. This leads labeled adolescents further into deviant behavior. Once again, those that are important to you are labeling you deviant. That ends up isolating you from people that would normally not label you deviant, and makes it more likely for you to engage in deviant behavior. What they found out was that parental labeling was extremely influential in younger people, youth, essentially older, non-black urban residents, and coming from intact homes commit more initial delinquent acts than others. As this happens, it increases the chances parents will see them as rule violators. And once the labeling happens by these parents, this increases the likelihood the youth will affiliate with delinquent peers and see themselves as rule violators as well, which in turn leads to further delinquency. So labeling a young person delinquent might not work out the way that you think it is going to. Allowing them to find out their delinquency and maybe change the behaviors themselves might be a more appropriate response if you have the choice to do that. Some other contemporary studies, Rosenfeld's studying of labeling and mental illness found that stigmatization attached to mental illness is a serious problem compared the receipt of treatment and services versus the perception of stigma on the quality of life for people with chronic mental illnesses. According to Rosenfeld, this provided an empowerment approach where psychiatric treatment, supervision, life skills, and vocational rehabilitation were extremely important to move individuals away from the mental illness label. But if they didn't have that type of reinforcement, Rosenfeld found that stigmas are consequential and negatively affect a patient's life. So this is kind of in the line with the previous theorist that was talking about reintegration versus stigmatization. And if you focus on a mentally ill patient with the idea that they are going to ultimately be rehabilitated, it's much easier for them to be rehabilitated than if you label them mentally ill and essentially give them the impression that this is going to be a lifelong sentence. Davies and Tanner, their study in 2003, known as the long arm of the law, and how labeling affects employment in reference to histories of crime. They find that formal labeling by schools and the justice system ultimately have long-term impacts on opportunities in employment. These severe forms of labeling have strong negative effects and ultimately make it really difficult for these individuals that were engaged in some sort of criminal behavior to reintegrate back into society, which ultimately makes them more likely to engage in deviant behavior again, simply to pay the bills. Some policy implications, of course. We see the rise in labeling theory and the impacts on U.S. policy. The juvenile justice and mental health systems started to recognize that there are consequential and negative consequences to, or consequential and negative natures to the process of labeling. Therefore, once they realize that labeling is creating negative outcomes, they begin to rethink how to best serve populations affected. And one of the ways to do that is to move away from labeling. We see this in the deinstitutionalization of the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts. This was a program that was ultimately created to help prevent the adverse effects of labeling. Yet they found that even when they were trying to not label, it was hard to prevent those who were in staff and the doctors participating in the study. It was hard to keep them from labeling those that they were helping. This process addressed conditions of juvenile correction facilities and ultimately closed the Massachusetts Secure Reform Schools and moved to a system of alternative community treatment and placement for youth. So we do learn from these studies, and the best of the studies take that knowledge and retool their programs to get closer to their goals.